Okay, so the idea now is that you, based off of your idea of what the sociological imagination is, you have already responded to the discussion board. So I want to go a little bit more now in detail about what the sociological imagination is, as well as some additional foundational concepts within sociology. So I mentioned that the sociological imagination, right, was coined by C. Wright Mills, 1959. C. Wright Mills is looking at what's called the power elite, basically those who are in positions of power. And he's very critical of them because he's looking at how these power dynamics are taking place. And that's where he's doing a lot of this analysis as well within the use and development of a sociological imagination. So he's very critical of some of the less critical analyses that are going on. He talks about this difference between the private and personal troubles and as it relates to the social problems. Whether or not it's just an individual issue or it's a social problem. Sometimes we may have just individual issues, but he looks at whether or not there is some sort of impact on the community and whether this is representative of these patterns in society. So by now we've already talked about this a little bit from the last lecture, and we have explored structured agency. So you have started to exercise your sociological imagination and you have used it within that discussion board. So what I want to do is I want to, this slide here, you'll have access to the slides, but this is just kind of reiterating what we've already talked about. So the very first picture I asked you to analyze was a photo of Starbucks. And one of the very first things that you've probably done is talked about how this is Starbucks. And if we were interacting in class, my first question to you would be, how do you know? How do you know that this is Starbucks? And generally it's because of the logo. The logo is an internationally recognized logo, right? And in case you didn't know, that's actually a siren. She's not just a mermaid, she's a siren. And if you're unfamiliar with sirens, sirens actually lure you to your death. That's kind of the whole point of the siren, right? She lures you to your death. So if I was asking you to use your sociological imagination with this, the first thing I would kind of prompt you to do, first off, I leave it kind of vague for a reason, but in class, I would prompt you to start thinking about what do we use coffee for? Why do we drink it? And if we're thinking about the context of Starbucks, first off, it's Starbucks, internationally recognized, international, coffee. And at just like a foundational level, coffee represents caffeine and energy, right? So why do we need to drink it? Well, because we're tired, because it's kind of a fix for some people. We need to grab and go because of the economy and the type of structure and systems that we live in. We're on the go all the time. So on an individual level, using the sociological imagination, just foundationally, on an individual level, if we're thinking about Starbucks, we go to Starbucks because we like the taste of it or because we meet up with our friends, it's kind of comfortable. They like to advertise themselves as the third place. So the first place is work, second is home, or first is home. The idea is that your first and second place are home and work. I would argue, depending on who you are and how you are and what your life kind of looks like, but your third place should be Starbucks. I worked for Starbucks for 3 years in Beverly Hills. So, a lot of those kind of company values are still very in place. So Starbucks itself, that's what it looks like on an individual level. We need coffee because we're tired, because we're juggling a lot. And this is where that kind of private troubles that C. Wright Mills is talking about comes in. Meanwhile, the barista is, they're tired because they have to work a lot. They don't have time to go use their health insurance. They have to interact with employees as well as customers. There's a wide range of things that's going on. But what the sociological imagination allows us to do is to push beyond just the scope of that. What we're doing basically at this point is we have to understand the questions of why. So why are we so tired? Because the economic structure depends on it, right? We have to be productive. We have to exist in this grind culture just to get by. So we're tired because we're going to school and we're working and we're juggling family and we're juggling, our own struggles and everything on an individual level. But then we go and we purchase that cup of coffee so we can go rinse and repeat every single day. We get our cup of coffee, we go to work, we make somebody else a bunch of money, some big CEO or somebody who is reaping the benefits of our labor. Um, so we can go home and do the same thing every single day. Meanwhile, the barista is giving you the latte, who is doing the same thing, right? They're making this latte, they're handing it to you. So that way, some big CEO at Starbucks can continue union busting and shutting that down and sending money overseas while, you know, ravaging the resources of other countries and farmers and not paying them what they're worth simply for that single cup of coffee that they're handing off. And they have great benefits, but they can't use those benefits because the wages are low or they're not granted time off. And understanding like that single latte kind of is representative of our need to exist in a grind culture and the baristas need to exist in a grind culture while you're both making somebody a bunch of money because of your labor just simply to survive in our economic structure. So some farmer can also be exploited by some big CEO institution, institutional organizational CEO who is going to continue making profit off of the labor down below. The sociological imagination really does help us critically think and see these larger connections of both agency and structure. It is different than critical thinking because we can critically think on an individual level. We can problem solve using critical thinking, but the sociological imagination pushes us to see the interconnections between system structures, institutions, and ourselves. It helps us understand the whys of things, and it pushes us to understand our colleagues and our community members a little better, uh, ideally and hopefully, so that way we understand that just because we may not be struggling doesn't mean it's not a social problem. Just because we don't face the same issues as one of our classmates doesn't mean that we may not fully understand, but doesn't mean we can't fight for the same cause, right? Understanding the ways that maybe those in positions of power are continuing to exploit different people similarly but different doesn't mean that we can't stand in solidarity with each other. So the sociological imagination really pushes us to see all of those interconnections. Now, the next picture I asked you to analyze was this one. And same thing as Starbucks, right? We understand that this is Barbie. We know that because Barbie is an international icon. Um, Foundationally, on in this photo here, you can see that there's a lot of diversity, right? Lots of representation of different people. You have a wheelchair user, you see someone who has a prosthetic. There's different hair colors, there's different skin tones. There's a wide range of different things going on in here. And representation is very, very important. There's no denying it. But then we can ask ourselves, like, who is this marketed toward? Well, we know that it's probably marketed toward young girls who are playing with playing with Barbies. That does not mean that young boys cannot, but we know that representatively, young girls are probably playing with Barbie more. We know that this is marketed probably toward folks who can afford Barbie more frequently. We know that throughout history, Barbie has drastically changed. We also know, we can see at this picture that there is a wide range, but if you look closely, a lot of the features are still very Eurocentric, even though there's diversity. We know that Mattel is a multi-billion-dollar company that is also exploiting its laborers. So for the sociological imagination recognizes that while this is important, representation is necessary. It's beautiful and wonderful to see diverse people and to see that people who have not been historically represented are represented, right? And that's really important. We also need to go so far as to start kind of questioning and thinking, what does representation mean? Why is a multi-million-dollar company, billion-dollar company participating in this? And to what degree do they continue using this representation as a means of profit and the bottom line, especially if those who are constructing the Barbie dolls may look like some of these dolls, but are being exploited to astronomical levels. So that doesn't mean the sociological imagination also pushes us to understand that it can be complex, right? It can be complex that we need, like, devastatingly need diversity. It's valuable and important, and it has been devastating to groups of people to not see representation within these types of settings, while also saying that two truths can coexist, that we also need to hold them accountable, not people, but the companies accountable for exploiting labor and simply using diversity as a tool for their own profit and gain. So when we're thinking about the context of this within the sociological imagination, these are some of the things I want you to think about. In statistics, I want you to think about it too, because while it may give us one insight or one input statistically with values, right? Think about, what does it mean? If statistics are showing that there is a disparity with um, income and rent, right? People are paying far more than they're making. What does that tell us, right? The sociological imagination pushes us to critically think about this context. Okay, so when we're using our sociological imaginations, it's also key that we understand the importance of theory. I want to talk about um, three major theories in sociology. We are going to be applying them throughout the course and our case studies and analysis. But when we're thinking about theory, we need to understand what theory is. So first off, theory is a rigorous framework. It is used to explain patterns in our social phenomenon. It is to help us to understand what's going on. So I'm not going to go into much detail, but just remembering that theory and research, the scientific inquiry, are very closely connected, right? Because theory is developed through the scientific method. And we're looking at the explanations of things on a group or collective level, and how these things may differ. Excuse me. Okay, so within theory, we have kind of macro level theories and micro theories. Macro theories are large scale, micro theories are smaller scale. So when I say micro theory level theory, though, it does not mean that it's like individual, like theories on explaining human behavior on an individual level, like why I behave a certain way. What I mean is it's to explain a smaller component of society. So there's three main theories in sociology: structural functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. So structural functionalism. Structural functionalism is probably structural functionalism is essentially the dominant lens in which we view the world. And when I say we, I mean on a larger system-wide structural level, societal level. Structural functionalism basically says that we have this social organization based off of functions of and needs in our different society. So essentially, if it exists, it has a function. If if prisons exist, they have a function. If schools exist, they have a function. So all of these different things have a function. If it exists, it has a function. Even if it causes harm, it still has a function. So, for example, a functionalist would say that poverty, because it exists, it has a function. Um, and the function from a structural functionalist perspective is to motivate people because you don't want to live in poverty. And so with that, structural functionalism is looking at the way that society functions. It looks at the larger consensus of society while putting the responsibility and blame on individuals, and oftentimes. So with that, we all individually and as groups have roles because there's some sort of logical arrangement in our society, right? So the idea of structure, within our structure, things are structured accordingly. We all have different roles that we need to fulfill, and those are kind of determined as a way to distribute labor. Where it gets funky is that if we aren't fulfilling these roles, that's what causes the dysfunction. Another thing about it, though, is that it also dismisses the way that structure may set up certain situations intentionally to continue to marginalize and minoritize individual people. But I'll get into that. So with structural functionalism, right, each part of society has a special function, and with that, we have to meet the needs. So Parsons specifically is looking at like the family being the primary institution, and that society really needs to meet the needs of the family. Um, in very, thinking about the context of the time, very heteronormative perspectives. But in this case, Parsons, says that the father has the instrumental tasks, like the, essentially the important ones, providing financial support, and decision making. And those are the instrumental tasks in the family unit. And the mother has expressive tasks, so caring for children and providing emotional support. Society has to meet the needs of the family so that way these roles, though, can continue to be upheld. So that way the instrumental tasks can be met by the father and the expressive tasks can be met by the mother. Um, Everything kind of revolves around the family. Meanwhile, Durkheim talks about society needing equilibrium. There needs to be some sort of equilibrium so we can continue functioning, and that society does need to adjust though to make it stable. So, for example, and I say criminals into law-abiding citizens loosely, in the sense that we know that statistically speaking, the criminal justice system has unfairly targeted, folks of color. But in this way, from a structural functions perspective, society needs to make things need to provide situations to adjust to make society more stable. So, how do you reduce crime? You implement prisons. For Durkheim, it's really a big focus on equilibrium and a division of labor. The idea should be that we are constantly trying to make society stable. Now, with that, he also looks at assimilation, though, to some degree, and that we need to be assimilating so we have a shared beliefs and we have a consensus. One of the biggest struggles is that it kind of lacks a little bit of diversity. Durkheim does a lot of great work, and he, at the time, really was a big advocate for, humanization. So I'm not trying to say anything negative about Durkheim himself, but for him, it's really about equilibrium, harmony. So the idea is that we need to have some sort of sense of like norms and some sort of norms that we've all agreed upon. So if there aren't any norms or there are too many norms to adhere to, it can cause a sense of chaos or anomie. In that case, when there's a sense of anomie, there's no, well, he says there's no, like, we don't have a moral guidance as individuals. A really good modern example of anomie in our society is when COVID-19 hit and we were opening things back up, and it was a matter of wearing masks. Some groups' norms were to wear masks, some groups' norms were to not wear masks, some groups' norms were to wear masks in certain situations. It really depended, and that's caught, and from a Durkheim perspective, that caused a sense of anomie because there were too many norms across the different groups, and it caused a sense of anomie, a sense of chaos. And that's where from this perspective, that's where some of those struggles came from. And then foundationally, structural functionalism also relies heavily on this idea of meritocracy. It's this perception that we can climb the ladder and do really well if we have, skill and hard work. Those who are the best of the best are the brightest. Those who are the top with the most money are the hardest workers. That's essentially the heart of meritocracy, right? Is that you work hard and you have skill, you're going to do well. Problem is that we know that that's not true, right? There are many people who are working really hard and are incredibly bright but didn't have access to resources, or weren't in an opportunity to be able to exemplify that, or didn't know the right people. So this idea from a functionalist perspective is that meritocracy is kind of the guiding principle. So we just all need to work really hard. A documentary called Erase the Power of an Illusion. They talk about the idea of pulling yourself up from the bootstraps. If you've never heard that phrase, it's the idea that like you just work hard and you can pull yourself up and out of anything. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be working hard and working for the good of our community or working to better ourselves. It's not what I'm saying. But in the documentary, the person was saying that how can you pull yourself up from the bootstraps if you were never given boots? Some people are given boots straight from the get-go, and others they're taken away or were never given them. So thinking about that, the idea of meritocracy, we do look a lot at the myth of meritocracy because who defines what hard work is and what skill is very dependent upon those in positions of power. Okay, conflict theory is another one. Structural functionalism and conflict theory are macro level theories. So conflict theory is basically the idea that society is in a constant state of conflict. It's essentially our organization in relation to conflict and how conflict is built into society. Over the years, over the last several, like over the decades, there's kind of two schools of thought. Two schools of thought. One, that conflict is just naturally embedded in our society, and then the other that we are essentially socialized into conflict and that we can break out of it. Regardless, though, conflict theory is looking at the power struggle over resources. So, who benefits, who loses, the haves and have nots, who has designed it that way. They also look at struggle and resistance. So, who is maintaining most of the wealth, who's maintaining most of the power, and to what detriment of what people, and then also explains why there may be some level of resistance. Karl Marx, his ideas really are a lot of the foundation for this theory. Now, with that, I want to note that some people have heard a lot of really bad things about Marx or Marxism or Karl Marx. Marx just wanted to write literature, actually, but he saw so much exploitation going on that he didn't feel like he could do that yet. And then the poor guy ended up dying before he had a chance to. And the reason is that he saw the level of exploitation going on at the time of those in the working class or the proletariats by the capitalists and the bourgeoisie. Because if you think about kind of the pathway and trajectory over time, you consider that those in positions of power who have maintained power and been able to transfer that generational generation, right, are going to are continue exploiting those who are not in positions of power or have what he calls the means of production. Basically, those who have all the raw materials and the equipment will continue exploiting the labor of the working class. Um, some people might say, oh, well, that's just natural, or you can work hard, right? But the idea, if we think about the inequities that have been historically and factually in place at this point, right, that becomes a huge problem because that is not always a matter of just simply working hard, but a matter of it being passed down and hoarding spaces and wealth. Within conflict theory, there's a lot of other theories, and I'm not going to go into super duper detail with these. Weber's another one. He looks at the connection between Protestantism or that Protestant work ethic and capitalism because of like the idea of hoarding wealth. So, you know, God's favoring of people based off of how much they've hoarded kind of helps contribute to capitalism. Capitalism is an economic structure or system. You will hear that a lot of sociologists will critique capitalism. My stance on that is that we have yet to see an economic structure that actually is of the people, for the people, by the people. And just because we are against one particular economic structure does not mean we automatically subscribe to something else, especially in the practice that we've seen it in this in you know our social world. A lot of conflict theorists are looking at critical theories. So Adorno is another one who looks at culture specifically, and how a lot of times there's this disparity or discrepancy between cultural values and norms and who is deciding on what's valuable. Um, Feminism, critical race theory, the critical disabilities theory, lack crit theories. Those are all also they're not conflict theory themselves, but they are kind of nested in the same category. And then we have, sorry, then we have, and then we also have, and then we also have symbolic interactionism. So symbolic interactionism is essentially the meanings that we create. So one of the things I always talk about is how the middle finger does not inherently mean F you, right? We don't come out of the womb automatically knowing that that means F you and has some sort of negative derogatory meaning to it. The idea of with symbolic interactionism is that we've attached meanings to things and we've created these meanings through our both our collective and individual experiences. There's no biological basis to the meanings that we've created. Otherwise, it becomes what's called biological essentialism. So that does not mean that we do not have some sort of biological basis for who we are, but rather not every single person of the same race is going to behave the same. Not every person of the same sex or gender or anything else that's created is going to be the same. Um, and yes, I did say things that are created because the idea of sex being a binary of male and female is also a social construct because there are 6 different karyotypes and there's intersex people that absolutely exist. And if we pretend like that's not the case, that ends up completely dismissing and diminishing any race and groups of people. That is why we look at that from the idea of meaning making and symbolic interactionism, because we understand that these contexts of what we understand, how we understand it, is dependent very heavily on what our society has said and what our society has done. So essentially, it's this idea of social construction and the meanings that we make. That also influences our interactions and how we create those meanings through those interactions, the shared meanings transmitting knowledge from one group to another group.